December 1941. The nation awoke in shock and flames. Pearl Harbor was not merely a naval base in ruins. It was the symbol of a wounded, humiliated, exposed America. The Pacific, once a vast barrier of security, had become a stage of vulnerability. In the shadowy corridors of Washington, the silence was heavy, broken only by a whispered question. How do we respond? The Japanese Empire seemed untouchable, shielded by thousands of kilometers of ocean and an aura of invincibility. Any retaliation seemed like a distant dream, a fantasy born of desperation. But in desperate times, madness and genius often walk hand in hand. It was then that an idea so audacious it bordered on suicide began to take shape in the minds of naval strategists. What if, just what if, heavy bombers could take off from an aircraft carrier? It was a theory that defied all laws of aviation and military logic. The decks were too short, the planes too heavy, and the risk absolute. The most experienced naval commanders rejected the proposal outright. The B-25 Mitchell bombers were land-based aircraft, designed to take off from long, stable runways. An aircraft carrier deck offered less than a sixth of the necessary space, and it swayed over an unpredictable sea to boot. It was a recipe for disaster, a waste of men and machines that the nation could ill afford to lose. It was a one-way ticket to the unknown, with no guaranteed return. Yet President Roosevelt demanded a response, something to restore hope to a shaken people. America didn't need an overwhelming military victory. It needed a symbolic miracle. It needed to show the world and itself that it was not defeated. And to lead an impossible mission, it required a man who didn't believe in that word. A name, already legendary in aviation circles for his unbelievable exploits, was mentioned. A man who saw limits not as barriers, but as invitations. A pilot, scientist, and visionary who had spent his life dancing on the thin line between courage and insanity. The man the world needed, even if it didn't know it yet, was James Doolittle. James W. Doolittle was forged by adversity. Born in California but raised in the icy harshness of Alaska, he learned early that life was a fight requiring both strength and intelligence. He was small but fierce, and he channeled that energy into becoming an amateur boxing champion, an early lesson in how to face bigger opponents with technique and courage. That mindset followed him when he fell in love with flight. In the early days of aviation, when planes were fragile machines of wood and fabric, Doolittle saw not the danger, but the promise of freedom and discovery. While other pilots contented themselves with following procedures, he questioned them. To him, a flight manual was just a first draft. His superiors in the Army Air Corps viewed him with a mix of admiration and alarm. He was undeniably brilliant, but also dangerously reckless. His colleagues nicknamed him the Master of the Impossible. Every flight was an experiment, every maneuver a question posed to the skies. He was the first to perform an outside loop, a stunt that subjected both pilot and plane to extreme structural stresses. But it was in 1932 that his legend became immortal. He decided to compete in the Thompson Air Race, piloting the GBR-1, an aircraft so brutally powerful and aerodynamically unstable that it was called the Flying Death Trap. Looking like a barrel with a wasp engine and tiny wings, the GB was known for killing pilots. Flying it was like riding a mechanical bull in the midst of a hurricane. The vibration was so intense it threatened to rip the wings off. The G-forces were crushing. Doolittle didn't fight the machine, he felt it, became one with it. He danced on the edge of disaster, anticipating every wild lurch, and pushed that unstable monster beyond its limits, crossing the finish line to set a new world speed record. When awestruck reporters asked about fear, he gave the response that would become his creed: "You don't test courage in calm air." But behind the showman's facade was a cool, analytical mind. He wasn't an adrenaline junkie. He was a scientist who used risk as a catalyst for innovation. Every dangerous flight was meticulously planned. Every stunt, a thesis on aerodynamics and control. The world saw a speed demon, but Doolittle was just beginning to show his true genius. Fame as a race pilot could have been the pinnacle of any other man's career, but for Jimmy Doolittle, it was just a chapter. The true passion that drove him wasn't glory, but knowledge. In a move almost unprecedented for an aviator of his stature, he stepped away from the racetracks and returned to the classroom, earning a Ph.D. in aeronautical engineering from the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He understood with prophetic clarity that the future of flight belonged not to the boldest, but to the best prepared. The future wouldn't be decided by instinct, but by instruments. At the research labs of Wright Field, he began his most important revolution, one that would happen out of the public eye. He focused on solving aviation's deadliest problem at the time, spatial disorientation. Flying through dense clouds, fog, or the darkness of night was an invitation to death. Without a visible horizon, a pilot's inner ear deceived him, causing him to lose all sense of attitude and direction, leading to a fatal descending spiral known as the aviator's grave. Doolittle believed technology could overcome this human flaw. He helped develop and refine crucial instruments like the artificial horizon and directional gyroscope, which could tell a pilot if he was climbing, descending, or turning, regardless of what his senses told him. To prove his theory, he conducted the ultimate experiment. On September 24, 1929, he climbed into a plane with the cockpit completely covered by a hood. He was, for all intents and purposes, flying blind. Guided only by his new instruments, he took off, executed a series of complex maneuvers on a predetermined course, and landed safely. It was the first flight in history conducted entirely under the hood. The aviation community's reaction was mixed. Traditionalists accused him of killing the soul of flight, turning the art of piloting into a mechanical exercise. Some Army generals viewed his theories with skepticism, preferring battle-tested bravery to lab precision. But Doolittle wasn't building the pilot of the present, he was building the pilot of the future. He knew that coming wars would be fought in all weather conditions, and the ability to fly and fight without seeing the ground would be the difference between life and death. The man who flew blind was, in truth, giving sight to generations of aviators. Doolittle's appointment to lead the mission against Tokyo was the perfect union of man and moment. The plan was so bold it needed a leader who lived and breathed audacity. Immediately, he dove into the challenge with his characteristic blend of scientific rigor and practical daring. The stage for the dress rehearsal was Eglin Field in Florida, where white lines were painted on a runway to simulate the exact length of the U.S. Hornet's deck. There, Doolittle and his volunteers trained relentlessly. The crews learned to force their B-25 bombers to take off in a distance that seemed to defy physics, with propellers spinning dangerously close to the asphalt. Each plane was modified to the brink of the unthinkable. Equipment deemed essential, like the long-range radios and the ultra-secret heavy Norden bomb sight, was stripped out. To save every kilogram, even the tail guns were replaced with black-painted broom handles in the hope that the silhouette would fool enemy fighters. The freed space was filled with rubber fuel tanks, turning every spare inch of the fuselage into a highly volatile gasoline reservoir. The air inside the planes smelled of fuel and fear. In April 1942, the 16 bombers were hoisted onto the deck of the USS Hornet, which joined its escort and sailed west under radio silence. Aboard, the tension was a living thing. The men, all volunteers, knew they were on a mission with no guaranteed return. They studied maps of China, a country they hoped to reach on fuel fumes. Then disaster. More than 1,000 kilometers from the Japanese coast, the task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat. The element of surprise was compromised. Admiral Halsey, fleet commander, faced a terrible choice: abort the mission or launch the bombers immediately, nearly 400 kilometers short of the planned launch point. The decision fell to Doolittle. Launching now meant there simply wouldn't be fuel to reach safe landing strips in China. It would be a flight to the heart of the enemy empire, followed by a leap into the dark. He gathered his men on the pitching deck. Without mincing words, he explained the situation and offered everyone a final chance to back out with no dishonor. Not a single man stepped back. The silence that followed was the signature of a pact with fate. Jimmy Doolittle, the man who always calculated risks, was about to lead the greatest gamble of all. "Okay, boys, let's go." With those simple words, Jimmy Doolittle sealed the mission's fate. The deafening roar of his B-25's two Wright Cyclone engines shattered the tension. The USS Hornet turned into the strong wind, the deck rising and falling violently in a choppy sea. Waves crashed over the bow, soaking the men and the plane's fuselage. With brakes locked and propellers spinning in a furious blur, the plane seemed like a wild animal trying to break free. Then, the launch officer's flag dropped. Doolittle released the brakes. The 14-ton bomber shot down the short deck. For a second that felt like eternity, as it left the ship's safety, the plane sank toward the foaming waves. Hearts in the control tower stopped, and then, with the stubbornness that mirrored its pilots, the aircraft clawed the air and began to climb slowly, a dark silhouette against a gray, hostile sky. One by one, the other 15 bombers followed suit, each takeoff an individual battle against gravity and fear. In the air, they formed up and headed west, flying so low over the waves that salty spray hit the windshields. It was a desperate tactic to fly under enemy radar. Inside the cramped, cold cabins, the atmosphere was one of absolute concentration. They navigated by clocks, compasses, and the kind of instinct born only of experience, an irony for the man who had pioneered instrument flight. After hours of tense flight, the Japanese coast appeared. The enemy, so confident in its inviolability, was caught in a state of incredulous shock. Sparse anti-aircraft defenses opened fire, but it was too late. Over Tokyo and other cities, the B-25s dropped their loads. The bombs hit oil refineries, factories, and naval docks. The material damage was modest, but that was never the primary measure of success. The real target was the enemy's mind and America's soul. The sound of explosions on Japanese soil was a psychological thunderclap that echoed around the globe, shattering forever the myth of Japan's invincibility. The bombing mission was complete. Now began the survival mission. With fuel gauges dropping to zero, the planes headed for China. Night fell, and with it came a storm. One by one, the crews bailed out or made forced landings in the darkness, their fates left to chance in a foreign land occupied by the enemy. Doolittle and his raiders had become ghosts, lost on the war map, but immortalized in the tapestry of history. Lost in the darkness over China, Doolittle bailed out of his plane when the last drop of fuel ran out. He landed in a rice paddy, soaked and alone, with a bitter certainty in his heart. He had failed. As commander, he had lost all 16 of his aircraft. The whereabouts of his 79 men was an agonizing mystery. He was convinced he would face a court-martial for his incompetence. When he was finally rescued by Chinese guerrillas and made it to an American outpost, his first question was about his men. The news that most had survived was a relief, but the loss of some to death or capture, including the brutal execution of 3 crewmen by the Japanese, would weigh on his conscience forever. While Doolittle grappled with his sense of failure, America erupted in a euphoria he couldn't comprehend. News of the Doolittle Raid electrified the nation. Newspapers ran fist-sized headlines. Radio newsreels narrated the tale of bravery with voices trembling with pride. The raid was the shot of hope the country desperately needed. In a world of grim news, Doolittle and his raiders were a blinding ray of light.
To his complete surprise, upon returning to the United States, he wasn't greeted by a court but by a celebrating nation. He was promoted to brigadier general, and in a White House ceremony, President Roosevelt pinned the Congressional Medal of Honor to his uniform. Cameras flashed, dignitaries applauded. Doolittle stood there, a man deeply uncomfortable in the spotlight, feeling like a fraud. To him, the hero was an abstract ideal. The loss of his men was concrete pain. Public glory and private guilt waged a silent war within him. While America celebrated the symbol, the man wrestled with reality. He had learned leadership's cruelest lesson. The commander reaps the laurels of victory, but also carries the scars of every loss. The pilot who sought the limits of machines now confronted the limits of the human spirit. He tried to fade away, seek anonymity, but the war wasn't done with him. Yet. The same talent for solving Tokyo's impossible puzzle made him the obvious choice for the war's greatest air challenge, breaking the Luftwaffe's supremacy over Europe's skies.
In late 1943, General Jimmy Doolittle arrived in England to take command of the mighty 8th Air Force. The 8th was the hammer of America's daylight bombing strategy, an air armada designed to crush Hitler's war machine from the inside out. But what Doolittle found wasn't a hammer, but an instrument breaking against the anvil of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. The situation was catastrophic. The war in Europe's skies had become a brutal routine of attrition. Every day, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers took off from foggy English bases for missions deep into German territory. And every day the sky filled with their flaming wreckage. The statistics were terrifying. A bomber crew's chance of completing its 25-mission tour was less than 25%. Air bases were filled with empty bunks and a silent tension. The men lived on a knife's edge, knowing each mission could be their last. The problem was the Luftwaffe. Piloted by seasoned veterans, the Experten, who tallied their victories in the hundreds, and equipped with formidable fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, the Luftwaffe was the undisputed mistress of Reich's skies. The American doctrine that tight bomber formations could defend themselves with their own firepower had proven tragically wrong. American escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were effective but had an Achilles heel: range. They could accompany the bombers only to Germany's border. The moment they turned back on low fuel, German fighter squadrons pounced. It was like a pack of wolves waiting for the sheepdogs to leave before attacking the defenseless flock. Doolittle, the scientist, dove into the data. He studied maps, combat reports, loss rates. He didn't see just numbers, he saw lives wasted by a flawed strategy. He visited bases, talked to exhausted pilots and overworked mechanics. He smelled oil, cordite, and despair. The man who had pioneered instrument flight now needed to navigate his Air Force through the darkest storm, a storm of fire and steel from which few returned. The question wasn't how to win, but how to survive. The key to Doolittle's puzzle arrived in the form of the sleek, revolutionary aircraft, the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally designed for the Royal Air Force, the Mustang was promising but mediocre at high altitude. Genius struck when Rolls-Royce engineers decided to fit the American airframe with their superb Merlin engine, the same that powered the Spitfire. The union was magical. The result was a fighter that combined speed, agility, and, most importantly, unprecedented range. With external fuel tanks, the Mustang could fly from London to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and return home. It could go anywhere the bombers went. Doolittle recognized immediately that this was the weapon that could change the war. But having the weapon was only half the solution. The other half was tactics.
and it was here that Doolittle made the most radical and controversial decision of his command, one that went against everything military doctrine taught. The standard policy was that escort fighters should stay close to the bombers, acting as reactive bodyguards. Doolittle saw this as a waste of the Mustang's offensive potential. In an order that sent shockwaves through the command, he broke the chains. He unleashed his fighter pilots. The new directive was bold and brutally simple. Your first mission is to destroy German fighters. Find them, pursue them, destroy them. He turned his watchdogs into a pack of wolves. The change was immediate and devastating for the Luftwaffe. Instead of passively waiting for German fighters to mass and attack the bombers, Mustang squadrons now swept the sky ahead of the main force, actively hunting the enemy. They ambushed German fighters over their own airfields as they climbed or landed. German pilots, accustomed to dictating combat terms, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against a technologically superior and tactically unleashed adversary. The balance of power in Europe's skies shifted dramatically. The Experten, the Luftwaffe's irreplaceable aces, began falling in unsustainable numbers. Doolittle was no longer just trying to protect his bombers. He was systematically dismantling the enemy air force piece by piece. The cerebral strategist had once again found a brilliant and bold solution to a seemingly insoluble problem.
With the Luftwaffe reeling under the new Mustang offensive, Doolittle felt the moment for the coup de grace had arrived. The plan, developed in secret and with the highest priority, was codenamed Operation Argument, but would go down in history with a more visceral name, Big Week. The objective was nothing less than the annihilation of Germany's aircraft industry in a single, massive offensive. For 6 consecutive days at the end of February 1944, the 8th Air Force, in coordination with the Italy-based 15th Air Force and the British RAF, would throw everything it had at the heart of the Third Reich's industrial core. The harsh winter finally relented, opening a window of clear skies. It was the signal. Doolittle gave the order. For 6 days, the sky over Europe became a hell of fire and steel. More than 1,000 heavy bombers per day, escorted by an armada of nearly 1,000 fighters, flew deep into Germany. The sound of their engines was a continuous thunder announcing the apocalypse. The Luftwaffe, desperate to protect its vital factories, was forced to fight. It threw up every fighter it could, including the new and formidable twin-engined models. The result was the greatest and wildest air battle in history. The skies filled with a tangle of smoke trails, explosions, parachutes, and spiraling planes. From his command bunker in England, Doolittle orchestrated the battle, a conductor of a symphony of destruction. Each loss report was a stab to his heart, but he held firm to the strategy. The gamble paid off. Fighter assembly plants in cities like Leipzig, Brunswick, and Regensburg were pulverized. German aircraft production was drastically reduced. But the deadliest blow was to the pilots. In a single week, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 400 of its best pilots, veterans who couldn't be replaced. It lost the backbone of its fighting force. When Big Week ended, American victory was undeniable, but the cost was immense. Hundreds of bombers and dozens of fighters had been lost, with over 2,600 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured. Doolittle knew he had won, but victory tasted bitter. He had broken the Luftwaffe, and in doing so secured air supremacy for the D-Day invasion, which would come just months later. The path to final victory in Europe was now open. When silence finally fell over Europe in May 1945, the world erupted in celebration. But Jimmy Doolittle, the man who commanded the thunder, found little solace in the quiet. He had returned from the war as one of America's greatest heroes, a 4-star general whose name was synonymous with victory. But inside, he was a haunted man. He couldn't forget the faces of the young pilots he sent into danger, the loss reports he read every morning, the empty bunks in English bases. The war had left him with an invisible scar that public adulation couldn't heal. He tried to reintegrate into civilian life, becoming vice president of Shell Oil and serving on countless government advisory boards, always lending his brilliant mind to shape the jet age and the space race. Yet he remained an intensely private man, uncomfortable with his legendary status. When people praised his courage, he corrected them, saying the true heroes were the men who didn't return. He deflected compliments with his signature phrase, "I just did my job." But the weight of that job haunted him. He spent his retirement years in a quiet house on California's coast. There, he walked alone on the beach, gazing at the same Pacific horizon he had once crossed on an impossible mission. The roar of propellers had been replaced by the gentle sound of waves, but the echo of war never fully faded. Decades passed, and history solidified his legacy. Jimmy Doolittle was not just a daring pilot, he was an architect of victory. He proved that scientific innovation, combined with bold strategy and unyielding leadership, could overcome any obstacle. From instrument flight to the Tokyo Raid, from unleashing fighters to destroying the Luftwaffe, every chapter of his life was a masterclass in turning the impossible into the inevitable. He wasn't just the messenger that America could strike back. He was the proof that human ingenuity and determination could redefine the limits of what's possible. In the end, frail but with the same piercing eyes, he reflected, "The sky never belonged to me. It just lent me its lessons." And the greatest lesson he left us is that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The decision to press on even when the ground falls away beneath your feet. And now, I ask you, what would you have done in his place? Would you have taken off from that unstable deck, knowing you might not return? Would you have dared to change the rules in the middle of history's greatest war? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know how far your courage would take you. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there are many more stories of courage, sacrifice, and humanity that time has nearly forgotten, and you deserve to hear them before they vanish from the sky of memory.